Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic: a newly discovered seismic hazard in the Middle East. Sit back and relax and enjoy today's episode of the Daily Bolt. Okay, so we've had an interesting discovery in the world of seismology that a lot of people would not have necessarily expected. And we're not talking about California. We're not talking about the Pacific Ring of Fire. We're talking about another area of the world which certainly has had earthquakes, but not necessarily is known for tsunamis. And a recent study that is going to be published shortly in the Marine Geology Journal points out that in the not-so-distant past, there have been significant tsunamis along the Arabian Peninsula. This is not necessarily an area that most people have focused a lot of attention on in terms of geology or seismology. What we're talking about here is the Arabian tectonic plate, which occupies the area of the Arabian Peninsula and extends a little bit to the west into the Red Sea, a little bit to the south in the Gulf of Aden between the Arabian Peninsula and Somalia, eastward into the northwestern Indian Ocean, and through the eastern part of the Persian Gulf. And again, continuing on up then with the border between Saudi Arabia and Iran and up to Turkey. It's a small plate. It's not one of the bigger tectonic plates, but it is basically moving away from Africa and towards Southwest Asia and Europe. And the collision of this plate has with the Eurasian plate, which is a much bigger plate to its north, and with the Anatolian plate, a very, very small plate that occupies most of the area between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. This area of tectonic activity is known for creating substantial earthquakes in Turkey that have occurred in recent years and have gotten quite a bit of news coverage. They've caused a lot of damage. There have been fatalities. Very big deals there. There have also been significant earthquakes in Iran in many cities. And so those earthquake hazards are well known and well documented. This one is something a little bit new. And it was discovered by the examination of very large boulders along a particular strip of coastal Oman, which is a small country to the southeast of Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Peninsula. It's known as the Sultanate of Oman. Very traditional structure for the government in that part of the world, where there's a ruling royal family, and they basically run everything. It's much more stable politically than its neighbor Yemen to its immediate south and east, but it's much closer to the boundary of the Arabian plate, the Indian plate, and the Eurasian plate, especially the Eurasian plate, as it passes into the Persian Gulf. That boundary passing into the Persian Gulf, as I mentioned before. And so what we have is evidence that's been recently documented of extremely large boulders that inundated the coastal area of Oman about 1,000 years ago, AD 1,000 to 1,050 or so. Not that very long ago in geologic time. And these boulders are not consistent with the rock types that were necessarily found in the region. They were picked up. It was believed that they were broken off from another part of the coastal region of Oman and carried by a tsunami that was at least 40 to 45 feet high, perhaps taller, carried by the force of the water. Okay, you would think, okay, what about these rocks? Well, how big of boulders are we talking about? We're talking about boulders that weigh about 100 metric tons. That's about the weight of a large tank. The The largest boulder itself weighed in at about 100 metric tons exactly, 220,000 pounds, putting that into a unit of measure that for weight that you might be more familiar with. These rocks were identified by their quartz crystals, and we were able to date those rocks based on dating the quartz in the rock itself. And it generally gives you a value of about 1,000 years. So they were not in that position for very long in terms of geologic time. They had to be brought there somehow. And the waves from a tsunami triggered by earthquakes underneath the Persian Gulf and the extreme northwestern Indian Ocean would have been enough to carry these rocks. This is an area of the world where there is no warning system for tsunamis. It was not considered to be a hazardous area as far as tsunamis go. These new recent results suggest otherwise. And so now there are recommendations being put in place as part of the article that's going to be published in Marine Geology, but also recommendations made to the various governments of the region to have some sort of warning system in place for earthquake events and especially tsunamis. And you might want to think about this. This has implications for far more than just the country of Oman, and even for the coastal regions of the other countries involved, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. And Iraq, for that matter, as well. What we're talking about here is an area, the Persian Gulf, which is extremely important strategically for shipping, oil production, oil refining. There is a huge economic impact that could be devastating if a tsunami were to hit. It would be potentially as damaging and devastating as the tsunami in the Fukushima event 8 years ago in Japan was to that part of Japan and to Japan's economy and power grid generation. This is something that probably should be undertaken with some urgency given the overall importance of the Persian Gulf region to the world economy, in particular with oil supply and with shipping. So this particular study, which the geologists looked at more in terms of coming up with a way to figure out what some of the oddities of the geology of the region were, actually has very practical applications that have some urgency attached to them. So the take-home message from this particular story and this research is you never know what your research might uncover that has major implications. So even the smallest, seemingly most insignificant piece of science might somehow, someday, be very important. Something to think about. That's all I have for you for this edition of the Daily Bolt. Dr. Jeff Tilley here, wishing you God bless and a good day or evening wherever you are, and a safe week of travel for those of you in the U.S. and elsewhere that are celebrating a holiday period this week.